Welcome to LinkedIn Live Conversation of the European Training Foundation. For those that don't know us yet, European Training Foundation is a European Union agency working on the topic of human capital development in the EU neighboring countries, from Morocco to Uzbekistan and from Belarus to Egypt. ETF's mandate is to support and advise EU neighboring countries on the possible pathways to reform their education and training systems, including related employment, innovation, and social policies. We collaborate on a country-specific as well as multi-country and regional basis. We frequently operate in uncertain and at times fast-changing environments. Yet, oftentimes, ETF is called on by governments to provide support, policy advice, and policy support. So today we're going to talk about the kitchen of how the education and training policies and reforms are being shaped and what role does the policy advice play in it. Let me introduce you our guest for this discussion. First of all, Mr. Eren Sunan, policy advisor, real policy advisor from the Ministry of Education of Turkey. Hi, Eren, welcome.
I am fine, thank you. Thank you very much. And hope all you are well too.
Then we have Carmo Gomez, Senior Human Capital Development Expert from the European Training Foundation. Hi, Carmo.
Hi, Maria. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, we have Yorgos Zissimos, Head of Policy Advice and EU Programming Unit from the European Training Foundation. Hello, Yorgos.
Good afternoon, Maria. Good afternoon to everybody.
But before we get started, I'd like to invite all our followers and all people watching us live to send us where you're watching us from. We really would like to know the geography of this broadcast and live conversation. And please take part in this conversation and send us your questions and share your comments. But first, I would like to start with the first question to the person that actually works as a policy advisor, Eren. Eren, could you tell us a bit more about your daily routine? What happens at your work? What is your work? Eren.
Thank you again, Maria. So generally, it's let's say most of my time in the week or daily process that I do the data analysis. Actually, I use most of my time about the educational issues and I'm trying to analyze the impact of the education policies. And I must say, my expertise is on the data analysis, and I am responsible to, let's say, that the design and also the collect the data and decide the research and the analyze the results and have some report about let's say possible impacts of the education. So I am quietly interested in the data and the quite in touch with the education policymakers. Let's say that.
Okay, excellent. We will come back to your daily life as a policy advisor into your function, so this is now over. But first things first, Yorgos, let's set up the terminology. What do we mean by policy advice?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you again for this invitation and for this initiative, let's say, to talk about policy advice and what we mean from ETF and what it means to the countries. Well, policy advice, first of all, is done upon request. So sometimes you can look at it from the side of the one who requests the policy advice, whatever that means, and then policy advice from our side, the one who provides it. So for us, it's a process, and in this case, it means that you introduce elements of science, of knowledge, of evidence-based advice into the policy-making cycle of a country, of an institution, of an organization. So that is policy advice in generic terms.
Yorgos, you mentioned evidence, the importance of evidence. So what role does evidence play when we try to find the pathway to reform education and training?
It's fundamental. Evidence is fundamental, especially nowadays that policy making is very complex and is often questioned by citizens more than ever before. You need some sort of evidence, data. Eren said that he's looking into data on a daily basis. And of course, data do not tell all the truth. You need to analyze those. You need to come up with options, with solutions. So policy advice does that. It looks into the context. It looks into the data. It looks into the trends. It takes a good understanding of the rudiments of the portfolio, in this case, education and training, to provide some advice. And ETF, of course, is an agency that has been working for years now into human capital development, especially in vocational education and training. So we claim that we're looking into that data, into the evidence over the years, not just now, and based on that, based on the context, based on the needs, we can provide the advice.
Yeah, you mentioned that obviously data gives you information, but then how do you interpret this data? I guess that's the key, and that's where there are several ways to go, and that's where policy advice can help, right?
Of course. Data is numbers at the end of the day, figures that you need to put them into the right context and analyze them. So that's what we do. We look at that. We have the understanding and, let's say, the foundations of education and training, because it has to be scientific. And when you're talking about education, you're talking about social sciences. So you need to apply those the data into the right context, into the right sort of environment, and that's how we provide policy advice.
Let's get a bit more practical and more concrete. Carmo, could you provide us some real examples of when ETF provided policy advice to EU neighboring countries, and what were the results?
Yes, and thank you, Maria, for that question. I think, in fact, we need to go in practice, and we have a lot of examples in the European Training Foundation to share. So I would just say to complement what Georgios said, that we provide advice directly, sometimes, to our partners in the countries, so the ministers of education or the ministers of labor or other policymakers, or we provide indirectly advice through the European Commission services. And I will give you examples of these two ways of providing advice. So we advise for what? We advise for preparing the countries for the reforms that they want to undertake or that they need to undertake. And what we have been doing as an example, for instance, in Ukraine, was exactly to work at the institutional level to create a new agency for qualifications that was very much needed as a step forward on the qualifications reform that the country was undergoing. So we have been for some years working with the Ukrainian authorities. They have made huge steps forward in their qualifications reform, and there was a moment where there was the need for setting up an institution that would be in charge of the policies and of the implementation of those policies. So what ETF did was to bring some examples to the table and to discuss what could be the best institutional setup for that agency, what should be, for instance, the governance model of that agency, and what could be also the supervision of that agency in the government, if it would be more on the education side or more on the labor side. And we have been working with the national authorities until the moment that we got to a legislation piece, and there was a formal establishment of the agency. Then, of course, there are other projects and there are other technical assistance agencies that are working on the further implementation of the policies, and ETF is always there as an advisor to steer the process. So this is one example. But I can also give you an example on how ETF sometimes do not working directly with the countries or upon request of the countries. We work with the European Commission services, so with the Commission in Brussels, and or with the delegations in the countries, the arms that the Commission has in each of our neighborhood countries. And we have done that, for instance, in Egypt and in Azerbaijan, where there are very large-scale projects being funded by the European Union. And ETF is there to monitor what is happening with the implementation of those projects and advising both the delegation and the government institutions on how the projects can continue and resume their activities. So these are two examples on how do we advise directly or indirectly our EU neighbor countries.
Excellent. I think we will come back to the results and first of all to the sustainability of those results a bit later. But now I'd like to greet our followers that are looking and watching us now. Besnik from Kosovo, hello, welcome. Snezana from Sarajevo, Xavier from Torino, Besnik from University for Business and Technology, Bounila from Prague, Keron from India, Georgie from India, and Keran from India as well. So welcome, colleagues, and please participate in this conversation. So my next question, to follow up on what Eden said before. Eden, in your work as a member of a team focusing on evidence-based policy making, and you give advices to very senior a person, decision maker, no? So the person that will decide where the country will go in terms of education and training. So how this process looks like, and how you, so is it on a daily basis that you see this senior policymaker, or is it a weekly meeting, or and how the advice is shaped in your ministry?
Okay, thank you. I think it's a good question and a question to answer actually. So we have been working as quite, let's say, strict deadlines, and we have kind of monthly schedules and weekly schedules, and so I need to separate them into daily schedules too, obviously. And so we are still in contact in the databases actually, because there are lots of, especially for the Turkey with an education system more than 18 million of students. So we have some, let's say, daily news for the education, maybe some daily issues to solve, and we have some, obviously, have more planned and scheduled considerations too. So in this manner, I'm trying to, with the other, policy advisors, we are trying to work on the diverse projects, and so we generally schedule them as as I mentioned before, like the designing of the study, and have data and the analysis of the data, and let's have the conclusion side. Let's say that as a 4-step hierarchical structure. So we are, working on some, let's say, other and different stages in each of these projects together, and we inform each other with the other advisors and have a more conclusion, and go with our generally with our deputy ministers and sometimes the other managers of the ministry, and show our conclusions actually. And so generally we are trying to have more, let's say, brief and comprehensive insights. So we collect both the qualitative data from our teachers, from each stakeholders, from our students. So the qualitative data, and we obviously monitor the quantitative data too. We have some kind of valuable combination of the data types, and to have a more comprehensive approach to conclude in both the short terms, mid terms, and also long term effects of the policies. Sometimes predictions about the effects of the policies. So this is kind of a, let's say, general structure of the.
So it's really, I can understand it's a really complex process, and it's not one-off thing that you provide an advice and then that's over, but it's an analytical process involving data and a teamwork involved, right?
Yeah, that's right. Maybe I can just say that this is not just for the impact of the policies. This is the same situation, and the same process is also valid for the defining the needs of the Ministry of National Education too. I mean, so we try to always balance what are the needs, what are the policies to solve them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Ellen. I think that's very interesting to know, the internal making of the policies. We have a question from Keron from India. Well, first he asks about education policy for India. It was announced on 29th of July 2020, and it's really a wise decision made by the Education Ministry. But then he also asked, do you also consider facts that need to be involved while EU policy making? I guess the EU-based documents and EU-based decisions. Who wants to take that?
I can say a few words about that. I think, yes, of course, we need to look at facts. We need to look at priorities as well, and that is linked with the needs that Erin spoke about. In a way, there is a priority in the needs, and you have to look at the broader context. We're talking for the European Union, of course, the green digital agenda. They are huge priorities that they have an impact, of course, on the policies at national and at regional level as well. And then we need to look at the facts about where do we stand now? What is the baseline? What is the starting point? There are different starting points. Not everybody starts, from the same level. So the policy advice has to be adjusted to that. Otherwise, you're proposing solutions which are not applicable in that specific context. So yes, we're looking into facts, we're looking into the context, we're looking into the priorities, and of course the needs. That's fundamental.
Karma, do you want to add something?
Exactly on that line. So for us, the facts are, I would say, the basic elements of our advice. Of course, that we have opinions, and we might have strong opinions as experts, but the main basic element of providing advice is that sometimes we take distance from those opinions, we analyze the facts, we analyze the evidence, and we bring the latest developments on that domain to the table, so we can discuss with our stakeholders, policymakers, sometimes ministers, deputy ministers, or other members of the government or public bodies or social partners, what are the best options for solving that particular issue or to progress on a policy reform. And that is the basics, I would say. So we have to have a very in-depth knowledge on the context that we are going to intervene. And for that, facts and basic evidence is fundamental. And then we have also to have a very strong qualitative information on the topics that we are going to advise on. Otherwise, we are just saying nice things and our opinions, but that is not what we call evidence-based policy advice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to jump to a next question. Actually, it's going to be for Yorgos. So one of the biggest challenges of reforming lifelong learning system and education and training in general is that we need a lot of time to see the first results. But meanwhile, the political life goes on in the country, and several political cycles can pass with elections, with new governments, with new ministers of education. So in these circumstances, how we can make sure that the policy advice is sustainable and coherent?
Thank you. That's a good question, and of course is very relevant for many countries. Ministers change, the environment changes. Pandemic, nobody could foresee that was coming. So it's a huge disruption for education. So you have many, let's say, things that are changing in the environment that of course make the sustainability of policy advice quite a tough case. But what does it mean here, sustainability? Because it's often is giving the impression that you will have it forever. Well, policies expire, huh? Just like milk, let's say, it expires after some time because it doesn't respond to the needs anymore, and the needs are changing. So, in a way, when we're talking about sustainable policy advice, we're talking about the flexibility into the advice in order to take on board new developments and to react into these developments, and that is very, very important. And then when we're talking about coherent, of course, policy advice, we mean that
because imagine that the minister changes and the new minister comes and he wants to do something completely different.
Of course,
happens a lot.
Any minister would like to bring forward his or her own agenda, and it happens in many different environments. But then you need to have structures. You need to have continuity in those structures, and when you're making a policy advice, you need to have that in mind. That what is that will maintain the policy in place even when phases are changing, and then coherence. That's also very important. Erin said it earlier on that he consults with different ministers, in fact. So when you're giving a policy advice on education, in fact, you need to consult and you need to understand the broader portfolio. And what is the situation in employment, for example? Policy making is not done in isolation in one portfolio, and of course policy advice is not done in isolation. So everything is linked, and you need to take into account these dynamics. And by doing so, then you are improving the sustainability of the policy advice and of the policy at the end of the day. So you need to have those safeguards on board in order to build the foundations.
Would the national strategies that I think almost all countries have, the national strategies for education, for instance, help to ensure this coherence? Or is it just one tool that sometimes helps, sometimes doesn't?
Countries, regions, the European Union, they all have strategies for the next 5-10 years, yeah? And that is the horizon. This is where you want to go. This is the vision, yeah? But then that unfolds into many different policies. And of course, policies are more flexible than, let's say, where you want to go, because sometimes you still want to go to the same point, but you have to take a different route. Mm-hmm. So that's where you need to bring in the policy advice, to offer solutions, to offer options that maintain the vision, but at the same time take into account all these changes. And for me, that would be the sustainability issue.
Mm-hmm. Karmo, in your experience, I know that, for instance, in Ukraine, they set up a new position, an advisor, a senior advisor that would stay independently of the minister changing, and they hope that it will serve the function of continuity. But with your experience in countries, what else can they do in order to make sure that even if the political cycle goes on, the reforms are going, they're not changing their direction every time?
Mm-hmm. In fact, having a medium-term strategy that is flexible enough, I think it's a very important element. And Eren can talk about the experience in Turkey, where they have set up this vision for the education sector 2030. So I think that what he can bring also to the discussion is what happens when a challenger comes into the picture. For instance, the COVID-19 came into the picture and nobody was expecting that this would happen. But now, how flexible is that strategy, or how realistic are still the targets and the goals to be achieved? So the policy is sustainable. But also we have other types of challenges, and you mentioned one, and that's what I faced, I would say, more often in the countries that I have been working with, and in my own country as well. That is when a new government comes to the picture and they have a different agenda, and sometimes a colliding agenda with the latest developments of, for instance, the European Union. Even if you are a member state, you might have a minister of education that comes and wants to put everything in question. And then how do you address still the combination of, you need to make progresses at the national level with the government that has just been elected and it's in power, with the European goals, for instance, that are set up and the member state needs to address and needs to monitor the progress over. And the same applies for our EU neighboring countries. That is, this, I would say, it's the most common challenge that they face, the rapid change of governments, and this idea that the government sometimes, they don't want to look to the previous documents, but they want to restart
from scratch,
reset the system. And when this happens, I don't want to say only the political correct things. Sometimes there are many problems related to that. There are discontinuity of policies. There are people that have been contracted for some of the priorities that have been drafted in one strategy that are fired because it's not a priority anymore. There are issues with the social dialogue, because sometimes the decisions that are taken are against some of the positions or groups of interest. So policy advice is not a continuing and beautiful and perfect process. It has a lot of ups and downs, and it has a lot of challengers, I would call it. I think I like this word. And COVID was, I would say, the biggest challenge in education in the last decades. I think it questioned a lot of
a real disruptor, no? Because
and it's
everything
really
closed. Yeah.
exactly. And I think we are all trying to learn how we are going to address the challenges that COVID has brought to the education and training systems, and what could be the best solutions in terms of policies and practices to put in place. And I think Heron can also bring his experience to the table to say something on that.
Yes, exactly. I wanted to ask Eden because Carmen mentioned that Turkey has a strategy, but what happened with this strategy when COVID came into our lives? So, was it flexible enough? Have you changed it? What happened?
Actually, I would like to just begin with some but the great mentions from Yorgo and Carmo. So I also really believe in the maintenance of the education policies, and this could be sometimes disrupted by the policy changes and the other changes too. But as you mentioned that, so I will not go into detail. But obviously, the other let's say the political changes can track the diverse roads or methods. But if you like to to solve the educational problems in a, let's say, more concrete way, so you need to, let's say, follow the some or nearly similar the logic. I mean, because as you all mentioned that, so the educational changes take really serious time to observe. And also, I think especially our stakeholders, valuable stakeholders, just like the ETF, OECD, CEDEFOP, and many also others, so have great contribution with the showing and sharing some experience, because of the fact that we have unique characteristics. I mean, each country have unique characteristics in their education, let's say, processes and systems. But we have generally, let's say, we face generally the similar problems too. So sometimes the having the best practices from the other countries, especially with the similar educational structure, that will be more beneficial to see some, let's say, the best practices anyway. So obviously we still have unique researches in our education system, in our culture, and etc. But this kind of sharing experience is quite valuable, especially in the, as Carmo mentions that, especially in this kind of uncertainty which is coming from the COVID-19. I mean, I cannot say that. So any country would have the best approaches to pandemic. Everyone is unprepared, unfortunately. So everyone is trying to find the best solution in their conditions. So in this manner, so sharing expertise and having the best practices is, I think, the value of these ones just increased in the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Just to follow up on what you said about COVID, there is a very good question from Snezana Duricic. I'm sorry if I pronounce the surname in the wrong way. So how we frame policy advice with rather feeble forecasting capacities in the times of COVID. So I think it's putting in the balance between policy advice and forecasting. So how can we find this balance, especially in times of COVID when we can't forecast? We really can't.
If I can jump in here, I mean, regarding COVID, it's seen by everybody that this is one of the biggest disruptions in education, for decades. So and this is global. It's happening all around the world. We don't know yet the full consequences of that. So that's important, because when you're talking about policy advice, we said it already, you need to know the facts. And in this case, one of the difficulties that, we still haven't got the full picture. If you look at the statements from the UN General Secretary last August, for example, that this is a catastrophe. Well, we are 8 months ahead of that now, and we're still into it, and things are happening. We know, for example, that the inequality is perhaps something that has been increased because of COVID. We see the trend there. We see also that schools, education institutions have difficulty to adapt what we've been saying for decades about the distant learning and all that, but now it's a reality and it's an obligation in a way. You have to do it, otherwise you cannot go on. So it's testing the limits, and to be able to provide policy advice in this sort of environment, you need to have the facts right. You need to have the context right. It didn't cause the same damage everywhere. It caused damage everywhere, but not at the same level. Not all systems reacted in the same speed. That's also truth. The resources you have in place. Some ministries have been almost collapsed because you had people in the staff that they suffered from the COVID. So when you're talking about the structure, when you're talking about the ministry, you have to look into your resources and understand what is your, with how many people are you working at the end of the day in this condition. So all these are important, and of course, if there is one positive thing in this pandemic, is the fact that we appreciate more the importance of facts, the importance of flexibility into our systems, the importance of early action. Policy advice has a lot to do about timing. Mm-hmm. And we realize that now, that things that should have been done and they didn't take place years ago, they didn't take place, even though we had them there in our strategies, in our plans, but for different reasons they didn't take place. Now that we needed them, they were not there. So I think we need to learn a lot from the COVID pandemic.
I think it's definitely the biggest learning exercise we could have imagined, no? And there is another question following up to what Karma was saying. It's from Silvai B. Chichi. As Ms. Gomez mentioned, when the new government comes into power, some quick fixes are asked from advisors. How has been your experience in providing these quick fixes, especially in terms of sustainability? Karma.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a very interesting question. My lesson learned during these years that I have been providing policy advice is that sometimes it doesn't work if you just shock with others' opinions and you be as stubborn as possible to continue saying that you need to go on that way if you have other people that are much more powerful than you and have the decision-making power in the countries to do whatever they want. So what I usually do when there is a request like these ones for quick fixes is that to bring again the information that we have from the evidence base, from the analysis, from the studies, and try to understand how we could mobilize that information to support the quick fixes of the system. That is something that I always do as an advisor. I try not to react like, okay, so if you want this, we go in this direction, because this is also, I would say, not something to be done. But at the other hand, I also do not think that we should, as policy advisors, enter in a collision with the people that we are advising and continue to say, no, you need to stick that way because this is your strategy and these are your policies and you need to go in that direction. So sometimes one of the solutions is that we put on hold some of the most controversial decisions or some of the most controversial policy decisions, because these might require a little bit more of time. And also it's true that in the first 3 months, ministers want to do a lot of new things, but after 3 months, maybe they had a reality shock and they start understanding that the reality is much more complex and sometimes much more demanding than they are thinking. So then it might be the moment where we can come back with some of the issues that we have left in the beginning of the mandate, and we can resume our advice on that specific action. But at the same time, I would always try to give some information on how to address those quick fixes. And that is sometimes is possible.
Karma, when we speak about quick fixes, yes, we mean how much time? That's my question. Because also for normal cycle, how many years have to pass before we see the first results of the policy advice?
That's one of the most complicated issues, because in education you need time, as we have already discussed. A reform in education to produce results, to produce meaningful and large scale results, sometimes it requires 5, 10, 15 years. It's a generation to produce those results. And there is a new government coming into the office, and sometimes the ministers want to have results in 1 month. They want to have results in 90 days. There is this new fancy way of
American
looking at
style, yes.
So the first 90 days of the government, you have to have already found 20,000 jobs for young unemployed through VET trainings and these kind of things. And sometimes these are impossible things to be made. So you can be creative. You can maybe say, well, this is not possible through vocational education, but maybe you can have a program that is an active labor market measure, and to see how you can activate young people and integrate them into the labor market. But this is the kind of advice that we can provide, and be honest with your also with your intellectual knowledge. I always make this effort of being very honest with my intellectual knowledge. So there is always this kind of verge of
a balance, always a balance. Yes,
a balance. Being a politician and want to have quick results, and then bringing enough evidence and sound experience to say, if
and
you want
still
to
have a
achieve
strategic vision in a way, no?
Exactly.
It's a very, very attractive context, this idea of the quick fix. It's for the policymakers that obviously the cycle that you mentioned, Maria, about the results is not always the measure. Sometimes the measure is just to show you have done something.
Okay.
And then, you don't have to wait for the results, because someone else most probably will be there. So it's more about ticking the boxes. So it makes this idea of quick fixes sometimes more attractive than it deserves to be. But I agree with Carmen. You can do some quick fixes as long as they're in line with the long-term
with the overall
vision.
I just wanted to follow up with that. And Eden, do you often see these quick fixes, and how often do you have those in place?
Yeah, that's what I would say. That so obviously, every manager tries to do something, let's say, concrete, more observable, and as soon as possible, obviously. But on the other side, what I will suggest here is that, from my observations, obviously there are lots of prioritization when the new management has come into task. And so maybe if you just comparatively for quick fixes, obviously there are some, let's say, issues or some aspects that you can more plan, and you can have, let's say, you can have outputs in a more shorter time interval, like providing and strengthening the infrastructure of the schools. Let's say that it's not easy. I mean, it's not so you cannot do that so quickly, but you can plan that like in 1 year or 2 years, and etc. And you can have quite observable, let's say, measures when you have done that with the required investments and etc. But especially for some, let's say, chronic problems, chronic issues of the educational systems, which are rooted for maybe decades, it's not so, let's say, easy to have a fixed solution to do that, actually, because it is related with the many hierarchy, many like the chains of the education system. So you need to have interaction, you need to get in the same line with the other managers and etc. So you need to move together to solve this problem. And what I will suggest is to do that. Okay, you can some more, let's say, quick fixes at some aspects of the education, not so, let's say, in a short time interval, but they could be in comparatively short interval. But if you want to go, let's say, more rooted problems, some rooted issues, that will take time, as the Carmo mentions that, and you need to have more solid observations about them. You cannot just solve all the problem, but you can set some strict, let's say, aims, which shows you the problem is getting easier, smoother. You have some step to solve that problem.
So one step at a time, really.
Yeah.
I would like to take one of the questions from our audience as well, and I think it's really amazing the questions we are getting today. It's from Bohumila Klablova. Are the EU institutions building upon knowledge from other areas of the world, both at the organizational level, at the civilizational level? Is there any stimulus created for knowledge exchange by the EU? Do you think a crisis in education that we're experiencing now in the third world is an example? Is a crisis of a knowledge sharing? Is it a crisis of a knowledge sharing? Who wants to take that?
It's an interesting question. Can I say a word?
Yeah, sure, go.
Yeah, it's a discussion that is currently at the front line in the EU institutions. We're discussing a lot about the idea of internationalization. I saw an earlier question about it in the chat as well. Internationalization of vocational education and training, internationalization of education and training systems, and how does that happen? I think there's a shift in the perspective of internationalization. Decades ago, the institution or the country that was looking outwards was more to offer support outside. Now there's a different perspective, and I think in EU we recognize that we're looking outside because we learn from the outside as well. So it's not just only offering to the outside, but it's also learning from the outside. And this is a two-way process. So it's internationalization in a way has benefits for both sides. For the EU, if we're talking about the EU, but also for the external world. And that is how we should be framing it. Now, how do you do that? How does it happen? Then you have tools. You have tools when you talk about internationalization. Sometimes you're talking about common agendas, for example. The sustainable goals under the United Nations is a global agenda. And of course, it is a tool for globalization because then everybody is contributing to the same goals. And that's fundamental. Then you have competitions. We're talking often about skills competitions. This is global skills competitions. You know, this is another tool that you can use to test, let's say, where do you stand in certain skills, if we're talking about vocational education training and so on. Then you're talking about qualifications and how do you look at your qualifications compared to the qualifications of others, either from outside the EU or from inside the EU. And that's again another tool to look into internationalization. Then you talk about mobility of people. It's fundamental today because it's mobility of learners, but it's also mobility of employees nowadays. And of course, one is linked to the other. So you study in one country, then you go to work in another country, and you want to be sure that the qualifications you gain, they can be used in a different environment. So there are instruments in place from the EU. Of course, the Erasmus Plus it's a pioneer program when it comes to mobility of people, of learners. So I think internationalization is perhaps a new dimension and is linked to policy advice, because you have to understand that whatever you advise, you advise it not for isolation, but you advise it for a global context. So you advise at national level, but in a way you advise with an open horizon, and that's very important.
And also there is another question coming for Eren actually. It's from Aristos Theokaros. Turkey has a powerful heavy industry. In what ways is considered in formulating policy measures and how often those are updated? Also, Turkey economy has had its ups and downs lately. Has this affected policy implementation and other education strategies? Was it necessary to implement any quick fixes? Eren.
No, it's a good question. So thank you, Aristos. So obviously, because of both the pandemic related and let's say the previous to them. So we have some, let's say, up and downs, as you mentioned, in the economy. But actually, from the educational investment side, so I cannot say that. So these, this kind of fluctuations affected the investments in the education. They try to from my observation, they have just some limitations on some budgets from the other sectors, not in education investments, but also other sectors, because with the education vision in Turkey 2023, so the education plannings and the education, let's say, the targets are prioritized. So they have tried to actually, let's say, prioritize the education in this manner. So as a, let's say, as an answer to both the previous question and also Arista's question, to give an example, we have some, for example, converted the capacity of our, let's say, industry, and also capacity, we have used our capacity in the vocational education high schools in Turkey to convert them to in the production of the COVID-19 materials which we required, which is a quite good example, and the many also international media is also quite interested in, like the BBC are interested in this issue. So we have converted our vocational education high schools and their production capacity to produce them in not in the other materials, but also producing the masks, face shields and the other materials who the professional healthcare's required actually. So we have produced them in vocational education high schools, and also we just deliver them to the people who need actually without any fees and etc. So I think that's a good way to both to convert our capacity in education in the production to our society in this manner. But as an answer to the last question, because of this power and because of this potential, so education is not an area to in Turkey to, let's say, allocating or decreasing the budget for it.
Yeah, I think what COVID did actually is making it clear that education is a priority in a way, so we can't really cut on it, and we need to be even wiser with our policy advice. And I'd like to go to the next question. Thanks a lot to all our followers. The questions are really, really good. From Mohammed Nasser Kraiti Sini, how can we make policy advice feasible and realistic? And I would add from my side, especially in COVID times, when we understand that the budgets are shrinking, we understand the resources are very limited, even more than before. So how can we make sure it's feasible and realistic? Who wants to take first?
I can.
Okay, go, Katrin.
I think learning from each other. That's one of the things that I think we need to make even more during these times. And ETF is very well positioned to do that. Also, it's linked to the internationalization discussion. In our work, we are always finding new examples and new policies and new ways of dealing with issues that sometimes in EU member states, in the United States of America, in the developed world, they are not that innovative on dealing with those aspects. So to give you a concrete example, we can go, I'm going to talk about Ukraine again, but you can go to Ukraine and see how they are dealing with vocational education and training provision using virtual reality, as in Turkey as well, to do the assessment of the vocational students. And this is how we can learn from each other. Maybe in my own country, here in the European Union, we don't have yet those experience. And that is the bilateral engagement that we can do that, I would say, brings not only the internationalization to a reality, so we can learn from each other and we can have this peer learning experience in a bilateral or multilateral way, much more fluid. And also in these COVID times, we have to be innovative and learning from experience. We have done a mapping of what are the different policy responses that the EU neighbor countries have put in place 1 year ago when the crisis has hit very much the countries everywhere. And there were a lot of innovative solutions, So there is this Portuguese poet that he says that necessity creates the creativity.
Is the mother of invention, yes.
Brings the creativity. So that's it. Maybe we need to pay attention, we need to learn from each other, and we need to be then ready to learning from that experience, create new solutions. And that's where it comes the feasibility and I would say, the reality check that Mohamed was asking. If we are going to provide solutions that prove to be good solutions for the problems that we are facing, for sure that they are feasible and realistic.
Okay, thank
Maybe
you.
I can jump in.
Erin, yes, go.
Yeah, so I think that's the, Carmel just gives, great insights about that. So I really believe in that because we are still struggling, but because as Yorgo mentions before, so it's a completely unique problem that we face here. Nobody has a, manual to read, and nobody knows the best answer in this manner. So, for example, we are, and not just in Turkey, most of the countries are trying to have remedial programs, have cover-up programs because of the learning losses in this period, but it's also unique because the time of the school closures are changing from a country to another. So let's just assume that you have, millions of students, and in other country you have maybe thousands of students, and they are not, they have some distance education in this period, in the school closures. So how can you structure in this remedial program? In which fields you prioritize? And there are lots of questions to answer. And so we have what, that's what I will call the common brainstorming is coming here. What the ETF, UNESCO, and the other stakeholders just have, create some sharing experience in this manner. For example, we follow up the academic papers, which shows that the learning losses can result in a losing of a training time, minimum 6 months, equal minimum to 6 months to 1.5 year. It will change, depend on your education system and how many months that your schools are closed, and etc. There are lots of factors to consider in the structuring. So, lots of the countries are preparing both the summer schools, night classes, Saturday classes, especially to compensate these losses, actually. So, because of this uniqueness of this problem, so you need to have some best practices and common practices together to solve this problem.
So, Erin, you really take some practices that you can learn from other countries, and you think, well, it could work in Turkey, right? So you take them on board when you shape policy advice, correct?
Yeah, you're right. So some of the countries, let's say, extended their academic curriculum to include the summer programs too. Some of them are, the structuring, like I said, this Saturday classes, night classes, and etc. So we are trying to how we can realize this change if we plan. So is it applicable in Turkey in our conditions and etc. So we're trying to our best. So this is what I think the common logic is coming from, actually.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Erin. Yorgos, I will pass you the floor now, but I will also like to reformulate a bit the question. How feasible and realistic is ETF in providing its policy advice and supporting the countries? Yorgos.
Thank you. I think one point to make here is that policy advice is not there to replace policy decision, policy making. And you provide the advice upon request, but then of course there is a decision to be made by the policy shapers, by the policy makers. So these are two, let's say, independent processes, that each one has its own meaning. Now for ETF, well, ETF is well positioned. I think Carmen said it earlier on that we were an EU agency, of course, that we were very open to the neighboring countries, and we're learning from them. It's not. We don't only develop our own knowledge in ETF, but we gain knowledge from the experiences of the countries that we work with, and that's very useful because that's how we build our structure, our policy advice based on that. It can be linked to context in these regards. So we have close links with each one of the neighboring countries that we're working with. We are in close communication also with the stakeholders in the country. Policy advice needs to take into account, needs to be inclusive in the sense that It offers ideas and solutions, opportunities for the different stakeholders to position themselves and for the policymaker to open a dialogue. It cannot be a policy advisor closes doors. It needs to open doors for the policymakers to decide. So we are doing that. So ETF is again well positioned. We have good experts. I think you have a good example today here with Carmen, but expertise in the house is very important. We have experts who are looking into the different areas of human capital development. Either these are more traditional pedagogical issues like curriculum development, teachers training. Either these are more linked to tools like qualifications, or to issues of governance, quality assurance, how we're learning, innovation in learning, centers of excellence is a new emerging area. So we're looking into all those constituent parts that either they look into the labor market sides, either they're looking to the provision side, how we provide the skills, the education training that is needed to look for jobs, to create jobs. So we make all these connections, and this is crucial when it comes to policy advice, to make those connections. So yes, I think ETF has those elements to provide feasible and realistic policy advice upon request, of course, and based on good understanding of the different contexts that would take place.
Thanks a lot, Jorgos. Thanks. Well, we're nearly out of time, but I would like to do a little exercise with our followers that are watching us now live, and with you, my dear guests. So the task here is, could you please write in the chat 2 or 3 keywords about policy advice? So what is for you policy advice, and how the perfect policy advice would look like? And you can write this in the chat and we'll speak about it. But now I'd like to start with our guest. 2 or 3 keywords about policy advice. Jorgos.
Well, relevant, scientific, based on context.
Okay. Carmo.
Trustful, peer learning. It's 2 words, but I want to make
okay, we take it on board.
And evidence-based.
Okay. Eren.
Okay, I would say the database, but evidence-based is more appropriate. Let's say the evidence-based and comprehensive and realistic.
Okay. I would like to invite all our followers to write their keywords in the chat, even if you're looking at it or not live, and the recording it. And at this point, I would like to thank our guests. Today we had Eren Suna, policy advisor from the Ministry of Education of Turkey. Thank you so much, Eren.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and everyone for their quite good, let's say, questions, and everyone for their participation. I'm quite glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Eren. Carmo Gomez, Senior Human Capital Development Expert from the European Training Foundation. Thank you so much, Carmo.
You are very welcome. It has really been a pleasure to be here and to discuss about this very dear topic to me. So I hope that I can continue doing policy advice for many years.
I think out of this conversation, we had several topics that we could have separate live interviews of 1 hour each. So still things will come. And thanks a million to Jorgos Zisimos, Head of Policy Advice in EU Programming Unit from the European Training Foundation. Thank you so much, Jorgos.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. And thank you to the audience as well.
Thanks to our audience, and stay tuned because there is much more to come. Goodbye.
Thank you.